Hello, my name is Dr. Sarah Minslow, and today I want to talk to you about teaching the Holocaust using children's literature. This presentation will focus on books that could work in the K through 2 setting. I'm the Assistant Professor of Children's and Young Adult Literature in the English Department at California State University in Los Angeles, and I'm providing you with my email address so that if you do have any follow-up questions or want to reach out, please do so. A little bit about me. I completed my PhD at the University of Newcastle in Australia in 2010, and my supervisor was an Aboriginal woman. And I started looking at nonsense literature from the British Victorian period and approaching it through a post-colonial lens. So looking at the ways in which children's literature criticized or encouraged the imperialist mindset and imperialist ideologies. And that led me into looking at more contemporary books for young people to examine the ways in which they other certain groups of people, the ways in which they show resistance or push back against racism or any kind of human rights violations, really. So I started teaching at UNC Charlotte in 2011, and I was teaching children's literature, but I was also asked by the Department of Global Studies if I would want to develop some courses that would be cross-listed. And so I attended the Silberman Seminar for Faculty Development at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in 2012. And from there, I developed 4 new courses: War and Genocide in Children's Literature, Refugees in Literature and Film, Child Soldiers in Conflict, and the Introduction to Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Studies. So since 2012, I have been fully immersed in this area of research around war and genocide for young people and how we represent war and genocide for young people through literature and other media, and then how to teach young people about war and genocide in ways that don't traumatize them, but do explicitly inform them and also let them know about the need for us to study genocide and war and to have a personal investment in these larger atrocities. So I have trained many teacher groups across the country. In North Carolina, I was part of the Charlotte Teachers Institute. And then I'm also a member of the UNC Charlotte Steering Committee for the Center for Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Studies. We hosted a conference, which is where I met Amanda Coven, who has organized this session. And she is at the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education. I also am part of the teaching brief editorial board for the International Association of Genocide Scholars, and on the project team for a grant-funded project out of Belgium called 21st Century Literature in the Holocaust, a comparative and multilingual perspective. So that's just to give you a little bit of background of where I'm coming from. I will say my background is not in pedagogy for young people, so that is your expertise, and I highly value teachers and have so much respect for the work that you do. So I will review sort of the underlying ideologies of human rights education. I will go over some books that I have used and that I encourage a lot of my students who are college students, whom a lot of them go on to become teachers, so that I share with them and we talk about how they might be used and sort of the lessons and that come from them and the strategies that authors and illustrators use when they are creating books about atrocity for young readers. So I'll go over a lot of that stuff, but in terms of how you choose to use these books within your own classroom, I always say that's fully up to you. I don't think there's any particular right way to do it. There are some things that I'll caution against, just that based on principles of Holocaust education. But if you do have any follow-up questions or want to discuss ways that you might incorporate these books into the classroom, I'm always available for consultation. So my work most recently has focused on human rights education more broadly and thinking about the ways in which we need to shift our education to a more international human rights focused modality. And 3 underlying ideologies of human rights education are global citizenship, so helping young people understand that we are We live in an international community, not just our local communities or our families or our nations, but that on an international scale, we are all connected. So really the goals of building international awareness and highlighting the interdependence between cultures and countries. The second one is coexistence. And so coexistence is focused on diversity and pluralism. So understanding that, equality and freedom from discrimination doesn't mean assimilating and requiring people to be more like the dominant culture, that it really should focus on everyone learning more about other cultures and celebrating differences. And so it's about intergroup contact and mutual understanding that can lead to social cohesion. And literature for young children has really stepped up its game in the past, I would even say 5 years, in terms of trying to do this in creative ways. And then the third one is transformative action. So it includes looking at historic and ongoing human rights struggles, noticing areas of discrimination, and critiquing power and unequal power relations. And the goals of this ideology are really about activism and participation. So encouraging young people, and as we've seen in the past, 10 years, but especially recently with Malala and with Greta Thunberg, young people are stepping up and leading calls for social change. And so that's what this ideology is about. Across the board, all human rights education emphasizes a commitment to counter injustice wherever in the world it may take place. So learning what one's rights are, learning how to recognize when those rights are being violated, learning strategies for responding to violations against one's own or other people's human rights are all things that young people can start to learn from a very early age. So when you're going to teach about the Holocaust, and I'm sure some of you probably already do, and some of you are quite new to it, I think a good thing to think about is, why does this need to be taught? So why has Oregon become the latest state to pass the requirement of Holocaust and genocide education? And, this answer at the bottom of this slide succinctly describes it for me. We study the Holocaust to study ourselves, to examine our responsibility in an interconnected world where injustice persists on a grand scale. We study the Holocaust to study our connections to each other. So it has a very past-oriented approach to educate about our collective history as global citizens, or even some people's own family histories, to remember. And, the never forget tagline for a lot of Holocaust education and the museums. And then to honor the dead, so to keep their memory alive and the stories of their lives that were cut short through hatred and genocide. But it's also future oriented, to really think about how can studying the Holocaust and studying these connections and studying to learn about injustice and studying and thinking about our responsibilities and our responses to unchecked power could help prevent future atrocities. And that's on small and large scales. But when genocide is, historically, when genocide scholars have looked back, there's what's called a continuum of destruction that starts with, discrimination laws being passed, or, rhetoric around, popular rhetoric about different groups of people beginning to get airtime and to, be spread prolifically. And so Irvin Staub, one scholar, says that we can disrupt this continuum. And as long as it's disrupted, then that could prevent the outbreak of actual genocide. So that's some of the stuff we can talk about with transformative action. There are guidelines for teaching about the Holocaust. I will say that mostly the Holocaust Museum in DC really does focus more on middle and high school education. So they do have a lot of great resources. And I've put a slide at the end of this presentation for you with a bunch of links to existing resources, but theirs are mostly focused on middle and high school. They do say, however, that elementary school can be an ideal place to begin discussing the value of diversity and the danger of bias and prejudice. So that's one of the areas where I'll focus today and show you some books that can be used to help broach those topics with very young readers. And then Echoes and Reflections, they have these pedagogical principles for effective Holocaust instruction. And so we can see these are sort of the rules that people have come up with. And I want to point out a few of them specifically. Defining the terms is very, very important. And I've pulled this quote from Angela Carter. She says, "Language is power, life, and the instrument of culture, the instrument of domination and liberation." So language is what we as humans use to organize our world. We like to label things and then make assumptions about them and categorize people and things. And we have to be very careful with the language that we use when we're talking about the Holocaust, especially when we're teaching it to new people and to young people. So for instance, you don't want to say the Germans were responsible for all of the atrocities when it's really Nazis. And there were some Germans who were actively anti-Nazi resistors. And also Jews, a lot of Jews were German. They were Jewish German people, right? So they did belong to Germany as citizens. So you have to think carefully about the terms that you're using and try to use them as best you can, as appropriately and as specifically as you can. And that comes with learning. And sometimes you have to ask questions and you might make mistakes, but that's okay. So Holocaust, defining that term, and then it's also referred to as a Shoah. And so there's different contexts for those terms depending on who you ask. I tend to use them interchangeably, but some people don't. And that Shoah is considered the catastrophe. And so a lot of Jewish people will use that term because it wasn't something that, they willingly allowed to happen. There was a lot of Jewish resistance. So, it was a catastrophe. The Holocaust was not inevitable. So this notion that war is inevitable, this notion that genocide is always going to occur, that there are things that couldn't be helped to stop it, that is not true. And we want to avoid saying that. We also want to avoid saying that it was based on evil, that Hitler was an evil man and evil people did this, because that word, it insinuates that it's some sort of supernatural force, beyond human control. And what we really want to help young people understand is as terrible as it is, that the Holocaust happened because individuals made choices and took individual actions and were complicit. And it took a lot of complicity on the parts of thousands of people in order for the Holocaust to be carried out. It was not just Hitler. It was not just a handful of his minions. It was everyday people. And so you don't want to suggest that individual responsibility is not part of the Holocaust. So striving for the precision of language, striving to balance the perspectives. So, thinking about the Holocaust from multiple perspectives. If we want to talk about the American response, there's some interesting stuff on that. If we want to talk about the German response, if you want to talk about those people who were in France, those people who were in hiding, are you getting the stories of the perpetrators? Are you listening to what Nazis said? So really trying to absorb as much as you can from many different perspectives. Avoiding comparisons of pain. So we don't want to create hierarchies of suffering. Genocide is terrible, regardless of who the perpetrators are, who the victims are. We don't need to create hierarchies. Everyone who is a victim of war or genocide suffers. Being sure to contextualize the history. So trying to learn as much as you can about the events leading up to the Holocaust, particularly the events following World War I and the breakdown of empires and the creation of Poland, and sort of trying to create this pact of non-aggression between Stalin and Hitler. And then when Hitler violates that and invades Poland in September of 1939, that's what kicks off World War II. And of course, that provides the cover for the final solution. Although we also want to be aware that what does become the Holocaust started well before World War II. So there were concentration camps in the 20s that were being built for political dissidents and enemies of the state, as they were called. There were eugenics programs being devised. There were the social death that Jews experienced throughout Nazi occupied territory in 1935 when the Nuremberg laws were passed. So you want to sort of, contextualize whatever the story is that's being told, and to make it human and foster empathy. So really thinking about not just reporting statistics, but giving a human face and human names. And that's one of the reasons why Echoes and Reflections really suggest using primary source material. So I'll talk a lot about fictional works, but matching those or aligning those and contextualizing those with primary source material so that students do learn that these are real events that happen to real human beings. And just making really responsible choices and knowing sort of what you're trying to accomplish and why you think what you're doing is the best way to do that. So some limitations of Holocaust education at the moment are, one is that there is not enough attention paid to the power of language. And I don't think this is just in Holocaust education. I think this is an education across the board. That when we think about language and labeling and discriminatory laws, and we think about systems of oppression and how they get passed along, and we think about the euphemisms that were used to pass, like the marital health law, sounds good, but what it really did was suggested that no one could marry a Jew. It became illegal. And laws that were passed that allowed for eugenics programs. They sound, like the purity and cleanliness of the race or something. And so we really want to think carefully about the ways in which language is used to empower certain groups of people, and then also to disenfranchise and oppress certain groups of people. Right now, there is a lot of condensing Holocaust education into one or two stories, and these do tend to be The Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank and Night by Elie Wiesel. They are most often used, and they're both very useful books for education and just being a human and understanding, but they're also limited in their perspectives. So Anne Frank and her family, her diary talks about them being in hiding, and that was not the experience for the majority of people. So to take her story and suggest that that is the story of Jewish suffering during the Holocaust is to collapse a narrative that's much more complex. And again, with Night by Elie Wiesel, which is a beautiful, wonderful book, but it is just one person's story. So I'm a big fan of a spiral curriculum where we start introducing these concepts early to children in kindergarten and second grade, and then we move up and their understanding of the complexities of the Holocaust really increase over time. And not including death, so making assumptions about what young people can and will handle. I will say that the majority of the books that I'll share with you do include death in some way, and I can talk a little bit about how authors and illustrators do that. So it's to distance young readers from the trauma of death, and it is rare that a child character or the focalizing character will die in a story for young readers. The golden rule of children's and young adult literature really is to leave children and young readers with hope. And so while some of these stories may be sad, they don't have happy endings, they do have hopeful endings. And I'll talk some more about that. Another thing is we don't want to offer simple explanations to complex questions. As educators, sometimes, especially with young children, it's easy to just give them an answer. And sometimes we don't like to say, oh, I don't know, or we need to figure out more about that. And so children ask really good questions. I've gone into several middle schools to talk to 7th grade students about genocide and the Holocaust, and they have really interesting, good, thought-provoking questions. And I don't always have the answers to them. So I think being okay with saying, I don't know, what do you think? Or where might we go and look for that information, or how could we better understand that is an important part of Holocaust education. So some of the themes and concepts I think that could be introduced in the K-2 space are diversity. And like I said, in terms of global citizenship and coexistence as human rights education, exposing young children to differences, and celebrating those differences. So I hate the word tolerating. I don't want to tolerate you. I want to accept you. I want to celebrate you. You're different for me. And that's really interesting and cool. So that sort of thing. Racism, discrimination, and dehumanization. And this also includes anti-Semitism, helping young people understand what those are, and what they look like in practice and in our world, helping them be able to recognize them. And a lot of the questions about, well, why would this happen? And so trying to think through that, like, why does discrimination happen? People are afraid of people who are not like them. And if they are never exposed to them, if they don't ever hang out with them, if they don't live near them, if they don't speak the same language as them, if they don't look like them, then often that leads to misunderstandings, and that leads to fear, and that leads to exclusion. And so how can we encourage empathetic responses when they see these things happening? Bullying and bystanding. So being able to recognize when you see bullying, or unequal power balances, and not just standing there and doing nothing about it. So encouraging active resistance. Again, however, we have to be very honest about the fact that not all people can engage in active resistance with the same results. So as a white woman who is well educated and lives in a very urban space, I'm actually in Los Angeles, I have a big voice. I have a lot of, if I want to go out and say something, or, go to a protest in March, I don't really fear the repercussions. However, I know, for instance, a Black man who might want to tell a police officer, no, you don't have the right to make me get out of my vehicle, then there's a very real risk that might end in them losing their lives. And it's sad that that's the world we live in, but it is. Helpers and heroes. So encouraging active resistance and really talking about the people who do help, and even the small ways that they help. However, again, there's a tendency sometimes, especially when working with young children, to overemphasize helpers and heroes when it is actually accurate that, fewer than like 5% of the population really did active helping in Nazi occupied territories. So we want to make sure that we don't overemphasize helpers and heroes, even though those stories are important and do need to be shared. And then personal choices and social responsibility. So really emphasizing personal choices and complicity and social responsibility, that we all have a responsibility to one another, that we belong to an interconnected global community, and that the issues that we face belong to all of us. And so if there is a genocide in Sudan, and people are fleeing and starving, then that's me. That's a me problem as well. And I don't know exactly what I can do about it, but I need to pay attention to it, educate myself about it, and see what's going on as best I can. So really leading to transformative action. Here are just a few of the bigger concepts you can think about how you might use these as foundations for Holocaust and genocide education. I'm going to talk quite a bit about these, self and identity, and cultural diversity, in the K-2, but also, recognizing discrimination, not being a bystander, and then ways in which we might resist, if we do see bullying or something, injustice. And then the concepts of empathy and equality and, being an ally and justice. What does that all look like? In the scholarship of children's literature, we really emphasize historical accuracy. That doesn't mean you have to include everything and all the details, but it does mean that whatever is included in a text should be historically accurate and not skew the historical record. And this is because Elizabeth Bayer says that in children's literature, you're actively creating a memory for young readers. They weren't alive during the Holocaust. They don't know much about it yet. So you're creating a memory, and you want to make sure that it's accurate so that you don't create what Zohar Shavit has called zones of denial. that might lead them to misunderstanding. Excuse me. We're going to look at some distancing strategies that authors use, using the paratext to provide context for the main story, and therefore creating a framework of response. You know, now that a young person knows this, what are they supposed to do with this information? The perspective from which the story is told needs to be considered. Which aspects of the Holocaust are included and therefore open for discussion or further lessons? Does the book reinforce or challenge negative stereotypes? And hopeful endings. And like I said, it doesn't always mean happy endings. So for young readers, if we're really going to focus on global citizenship and appreciating and celebrating diversity, there are a lot of wonderful books out there. These are a few of my favorites. And as you'll see, I've got some very specific to Judaism. So understanding, getting to know more about Jewish culture. So Rosh Hashanah is Coming is a baby book. And it's a rhyming book. It's a lot of fun. A Queen in Jerusalem is about a little girl who wants a gown for a holiday fest. And it is based on a true story of a Jewish man and his contributions to the art world. And so really focusing on Jewish culture and the rich, vibrant history of it and the contributions that Jewish people made even before World War II and the Holocaust are important, and that they continue to make. I really like these books, like What Can a Citizen Do? So it does promote active citizenship, and A is for activist, which is an ABC book, but it really talks about equality and activism and, you know, standing up when you see injustice around you. And then others about different, you know, the name jar is not we don't want this little girl to assimilate by adopting an English name. She thinks that she should, so that her fellow students in her new school can pronounce her name. But she realizes that her fellow students actually want her to use her Korean name. And Mommy's Kimar, and then Island Born, which is not specific to any island, but it does talk about island cultures and the vibrancy of the music and the art and the food. And so a real celebration of all different kinds of cultures. And that can lead into talking about differences in race and ethnicity, but not, you know, how none of them are better than the other. They're just different, and really trying to use that language to promote equality. I've put some ideas about possible learning activities around culture. So getting young people to tell a story about their heritage or their family's culture or a tradition and share those. Getting them to talk about a time when they were made to feel bad and what helped them feel better. Drawing a picture of yourself and all the things that you love. And so that's encouraging self-love. And the more you accept yourself, then the less resistance you are to others, hopefully. Having something like a Citizen of the Week and doing an election and talking about how elections work and why they're important. And then, you know, making a protest sign when you see things, when people are being treated unfairly. So maybe those are things you could implement around with using books. So these books really talk about war in general. There's this is a simple history of World War II, and it is sort of an introduction to World War II that talks about the events of World War II from the multiple perspectives. And it's done in sort of a fun way, fun but informative sort of way. Year of the Jungle is actually Suzanne Collins, who did The Hunger Games. And this one is about her experiences as a 6-year-old when her father was sent to Vietnam to fight in the war. So it is from the perspective of a 6-year-old. There's a lot of, it's kind of cartoonish looking, so it doesn't feel too real. That's some of the distancing there. And the scenes in Vietnam are in her imagination, and they're in black and white. And there's some comic relief because she has a little cat that follows her around and like eats crayons and does stuff. But she's still exploring the fears that she has because her father has gone away and he does come back. But she can tell that he's different, changed by the war. And so I think especially for young people who may have had loved ones who have been in war, then that can be a really useful book. The Enemy, a book about peace, is actually one of my favorites. And it is, you know, here are these two enemies, see them, they're in their holes, and they're both like, well, maybe if I just stop fighting, then he'll stop fighting. And so there's some back and forth between them, but it's a simple book, but kind of reflecting on why are we even fighting this war? And do we really even know what it's about anymore? And then Margaret Wilde is a wonderful illustrator from Australia, and writer. And this is the treasure box, a lot of collage. So she's taken real materials and put them on a flat page. And this is a boy and his father who are forced to flee from their home. And they put a book about their culture in a box, and they end up burying it under a tree. And then eventually when the little boy grows up, he goes back and gets the book and takes it to the library. And the town where that was destroyed in the war where they lived has been rejuvenated. And so it's a nice story. It doesn't have a specific location. The Rabbits by Sean Tan and John Marsden is a book about colonization or invasion. It's particular to Australia, but it's actually in the high school curriculum for Australia, but the language is very simple. And I think it would still work well to open up conversations with young people, although they might not understand all of the complexity and details. So it is the rabbits who come on this big boat, and they come onto the land and start imposing their vision onto the land. They push the native numbats off the page. And then they do mention stealing our children. So the stolen generation of Aboriginal children, where 100,000 of them were taken from their parents. So it was a very similar colonial process to what the British did in the United States in the colonies. And this book portrays it in a way that I do think is simple enough for young people to start thinking about it and opening up and asking questions about it. And the surrealism in the images distances enough so it's not particularly scary. I love to use Dr. Seuss to introduce to young people some of these larger concepts. So discrimination through the Sneetches. So they have stars on their belly, and then they decide they don't want stars on their belly because they don't want to be like the other Sneetches. And it's this cycle of why there's arbitrary differences between people and why we choose to use those differences to exclude or include others. And then Unchecked Power from Yertle the Turtle. A lot of kids love this. This was actually about Hitler. Dr. Seuss wrote it, and the turtle actually had a Hitler mustache, and the publishers made him remove it. But this is just about the turtle who wants to sit on the top, and he stands on the backs of all these other turtles under him who are suffering. And finally, one of the turtles in the bottom, named Mac, says, "Hey, this hurts us. This is not right. Why are you the only one who gets to be up there when all of us are suffering?" And so Mac burps, and it brings the whole tower of turtles down. And so again, an act of resistance, questioning unchecked power. And I love to use Horton Hears a Who to talk about our responsibility to protect. So the adage, a person's a person, no matter how small. The film version is actually really good for this as well, talking about the need for children to also use their voices to speak up when they see or hear things that are unjust. It can be a lot of fun to introduce these concepts. And then when you get into stories of the actual Holocaust, Eve Bunting's Terrible Things, an allegory of the Holocaust, is a good introduction. She does use the paratext and author's note to say that, you know, during World War II, many people looked the other way while terrible things happened. They pretended not to know what their neighbors were being taken away and locked in concentration camps. They pretended not to hear their cries for help. The Nazis killed millions of Jews and others in the Holocaust. If everyone had stood together at the first sign of evil, would this have happened? Standing up for what you know is right is not always easy, especially if the one you face is bigger and stronger than you. It is easier to look the other way, but if you do, terrible things can happen. And so that's really about creating a framework of response. She's providing the historical context, but she's also saying, when you look away and don't help those who need help, then you're complicit in some of the terrible things. So not being a bystander. It uses animal characters. It's only in black and white with shading and shades of gray. The terrible things are just these blobs. They're not actually like humans or animals. They're just like these scary blobs. The focalizing character is Little Rabbit, and Little Rabbit keeps asking, like, why do they keep taking people away? Why did they take the birds? Why did they take the fish? And his, you know, Father Rabbit says, stop asking questions. Like, as long as they're not taking us, it doesn't matter. And eventually the rabbits do get taken, and Little Rabbit hides at the end, and he survives. And he basically ends by saying, I have to go warn the other forest creatures that this is happening. So having a voice, bystanding, the arbitrary definitions of targeted groups. So the Nazis would just be like, oh, you're feeble-minded, or you're, a useless eater, or some of the terms that they would use. And anybody that they felt into that category, they could target for extermination. And then the point, of course, being that together we're better and stronger, and so not to be a bystander. A few others that I really like, the little boy star, an allegory of the Holocaust, where the little boy embodies the Star of David. And he says, throughout some time that the stars started to go out until the whole sky seemed black, and he had to go into hiding and couldn't come out. And then finally, at some point, he could come out, but none of his stars were left. And he had to join a community of people who helped him learn to shine again as a star. So it's pretty simple, but very colorful, and can address the discrimination, anti-Semitism, symbolism, family separation, but a hopeful ending of learning to heal and come back to after genocide or after a war. A hero in the Holocaust is the story of Janusz Korczak, and he was a dentist who hid a bunch of children in the ghettos, and he refused, when the Nazis came to take the children, he refused to not go with them. And so he did go with them on the train, and he perished, but he did a lot of good in helping to hide and feed and medicate children as much as he could. I Will Come Back for You, a family in hiding during World War II. There's a lot of stories where a grandparent shares their story of the Holocaust with a grandchild. So not their own children. There's seems to be a lot of tension there. So if you're familiar with like Mouse, the parent not telling their child the story of their survival, but often sharing it with the grandchild. The distancing here is that we know from the get-go that the grandmother survives. So there's a frame story. And so we know that she's going to be okay. This book also in the paratext uses actual photographs of the family that it's based on. So it does personalize it and make it a very human story. But it does still feature family separation and neighbors in different villages helping out. The children are in hiding in plain sight. So learning to be, to hide their Jewishness. And the father does not survive. But there is the hopeful ending where the family is reunited, and they come to America as refugees. Benno and the Night of Broken Glass is about the specific Kristallnacht, but it is through the perspective of this cat, Benno, and we see Benno about town, just, going and getting scraps of food and having people pet him. And then suddenly there's this pogrom, and we experience him hiding, him being very nervous and shaky and hearing the sounds of broken glass. So it's really good to link it to a specific event, but it's distanced by the animal character. The Whispering Town is another book about helpers and the story of community. So this community comes together, and when there is no moon in the sky, they help their Jewish neighbors get down to the dock and get on a boat to go to Scandinavia to flee from Nazi persecution. And they have to do it by whispering from window to window so that they can guide their Jewish neighbors to the harbor safely. And then Hidden is more like a graphic novel sort of feel, but it's childish. And you can see, again, cartoonish, even though it does feature human characters. It is the intergenerational storytelling again. So the grandparent is old and talking to their grandchild. The frame story provides that distance because we know that the grandparent survives, but we do see the discrimination, her being kicked out of school, her being made to wear a yellow star, the way that people start to look at her differently. And then helpers and acts of resistance as well. An introduction to Anne Frank through a cat's perspective is the cat who lived with Anne Frank. So talking about some of the things he sees out the window and some of the things that she writes about in her diary, but for a younger audience. Star of Fear, Star of Hope. It's similar to Lois Lowry's book for older readers, Number the Stars. So it is a Gentile character is the focalizing character, but her best friend is a Jew. And the Gentile character starts to notice the discrimination and ask questions about why her friend is being discriminated against and why she can't go to school anymore and why she can't, go into the shops anymore. and it features helpers as well. Rose Blanche is one of my favorites. This little girl, so Rose Blanche is the White Rose, which is a reference to the White Rose movement, which was an underground resistance movement started by 3 teenagers in Germany, and they were eventually murdered by the Nazis. But they had a very active and robust underground resistance movement. And in this, Rose Blanche is a German child, and she sees out the window things that are going on and sees tanks going through her village, and she follows them into the woods and comes face to face with the concentration camp. And there are Jews in the striped pajamas behind the barbed wire fences. And Rose Blanche makes the personal choice to start taking food and sneaking it to them. And then when the Russian army starts to approach to liberate the concentration camps, she's accidentally shot in the crossfire. And there is some distancing here because it starts in first person perspective and switches halfway through the book to talk about Rose Blanche in the third person. Her death is not shown or described. It simply says there was a shot. And then you turn the page and she's no longer there, even though she's been on every other page. And the end is showing where the concentration camp was, but it's grown back over and flowers are springing up. And it's about like regeneration following war and genocide. And then displacement. So there are a lot of books, really popular and good books about displacement recently. So I think making sure to continue Holocaust education beyond liberation, because clearly the effects did not stop with liberation. So The Journey by Francesca Sana is not situated in a particular country, but it is about a family that is affected by war, and they have to journey to a new place, and it's scary, but ultimately it's a story of hope and survival. Room on Our Rock is a very interesting book because you read it one way, and it's by an Australian author, and they of course have a really bad, it's they when I am an Australian citizen, so when they're doing naughty things, it's they. But if you read it one way, it sounds like the seals are saying, there's no room for you on our rock, so we would never invite you to stay here. But if you read it when you get to the end and read the whole thing backwards, it's the other perspective. It is, we have plenty of room on our rock. Of course, we would welcome you here. We would never say that you can't come here. So it's an interesting book, the way that it's put together, and pretty simplistic too. My Name is Sangol, again, about a Sudanese boy who comes to the United States, and his classmates have problems pronouncing his name, and he feels excluded and isolated, but his teacher comes up with a way that they can all do an art project that represents how their name is pronounced. And his name is Sangol, so he draws a sun and then puts like a soccer goal below it, and so everybody remembers his name. So cool. And then this one, I haven't actually read this book yet, but I did want to talk about Kindertransport, because that was when the British accepted 10,000 Jewish children from Nazi-occupied Europe, and they went over, and it was called Kindertransport. And so this is Saving Henno, the story of a refugee dog by this British author, and this is about the Kindertransport. And again, the character that we're focusing on is the dog, but he experiences the same sort of story that children who were part of the Kindertransport experience. You could also talk about the US's refusal to accept more Jewish asylum seekers, the St. Louis, which is covered in middle school if you read Refugee by Alan Gratz, for instance, and then newspaper clippings you can find online of the ways in which Jews and anti-Semitism was rampant in the United States. And that was one of the reasons why we didn't increase our quotas. So a few lesson ideas. I always think introducing the kids' version of the UN's Declaration of Human Rights and really talking about a responsibility to protect. Like when you see other people being, mean to somebody, what should you do? And why? How can you help? What does it mean to be a good friend or a helper? How to non-violently but firmly confront discrimination and bullying and see like what the characters do, what the solutions are. Empathy mapping, so really trying to get inside the mind of like the cat from Benno and Then I Broken Glass. What does the cat see, and how does the cat feel, and what do they hear, and what do they do, and in helping children empathize with that. Interviewing a grandparent or an elderly person in the community to talk about the history. What do they remember about the Holocaust and World War II, or something like that. So I have put the links here for existing resources. There are a lot of wonderful resources for educators. I will say the K-2 sector is probably the most limited, simply because most people suggest teaching about the Holocaust and genocide beginning at like 4th grade. But I definitely think you can make a strong foundation by talking about some of these topics and using some of these books that I've mentioned here today. If you do have questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to set up a time to Zoom with you, or to help you think through and brainstorm ideas for how to use these books and lesson plans. And the links on that last slide do take you to a lot of lesson plans that I think you'll find really useful. So thank you for your time. I hope you've enjoyed it and found this meaningful. And thank you so much for the important work that you do as educators.